I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And we're on page 247, for those who are along with that. And so we're at like there's the outline point there, D, right, where it says, although the view of the transitory collection and ignorance are the root of cyclic existence, there are not two roots of cyclic existence. I just thought to pause there for a moment, and I know we talked about this before, but I'm not sure if people remember or if everybody was here. Like, so what's the view of the transitory collection? Does anybody remember?
Aggregate.
The aggregate, so what's the aggregates? Or which part of that is the aggregate?
It's the self. Emptiness of the self and the phenomena.
Go ahead.
Six senses.
You go. Mike looks like he wants to say
Oh, it's like the five aggregates, yes, and holding that as the I.
So it's good we're pausing. I mean, yeah, you guys are not totally off, but it's just to be precise, because then we're going to get into this now. So, like, in many different Buddhist texts, they'll say the view of the transitory collection is the, you say like the cause, the root of samsara, or the cause of samsara, right? And so, it's an interesting phrase, right? The view of the, that's the way they translate it here, I think, right? View of the there are different translations of this term. Sometimes they'll say the view of the, that's as good as translation as that.
Is it the view or the wrong view?
Well, actually, we'll get to that in a second. That's what we're about to. So one point is when they say there are two different words there. I mean, well, view. There's the three words, but what they're talking about there, right? So transitory, right, or impermanent. So that means that part of the phrase means changing moment to moment, right? So that's the first part there. And then the word collection does refer to the. Usually it's used to refer to the five aggregates. But then, so it's a view on or a view of, what do they say? The view of, yeah, is the way they say it here. And so what they're saying, usually the way it's defined is like a grasping, and different tenet systems will define it slightly differently, of course, because they have different understandings, but here we're using the Prasangika Majjhamaka perspective. So we'll say, viewing I, a sense of a self, like so, and mine. So I and mine, or self and mine, as existing intrinsically within the five aggregates, or existing from the side of the five aggregates. And so it includes those two things, right? A sense of I and a sense of mine. Existing, and there are different phrases we use, right? Existing from the side of, existing inherently, existing intrinsically within the five aggregates. It's a little, I mean, if we pause for a moment, it's a little bit, because actually of course the I does exist in dependence upon the transitory five aggregates. Right? And the Prasangika Majjhamaka school would say, it exists as independence upon or merely labeled upon. But it doesn't exist from the side of the aggregates, right? Which means it doesn't exist inherently, or it doesn't exist intrinsically. So when we say the view of the transitory collection, it's sort of what? So it's when one looks at one's own, and this is referring also, it's an important point, the view of the transitory collection is referring to one's own self. So it's like when one sees one's own five aggregates, or some combination of them, one, you may be paying attention to all five, or you may be paying attention at that moment to one or more of them, and it's a view grasping at and believing in a sense of I and mine existing from the side of the aggregates. So existing there. Okay, so that's a brief summary, right, of what's the view of the transitory collection. But it's interesting, isn't it? Like, one is it's pointing out, what's that, you say it right? That we grasp with, that we grasp with a self based upon a collection of things, right? It's not just on one thing, which is ever changing, right? Because all the aggregates, it's the nature of the aggregates, right, isn't it, that they're impermanent. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at a philosophical point. That's actually, and then we'll see how it's relevant to practice. But he quotes Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, where Nagarjuna says, "As long as one apprehends the aggregates, so long will one apprehend a self. If there is this apprehension, there is karma, and from karma there's birth." And then Lama Tsongkhapa comments, he says, "The apprehension of a self of phenomena that apprehends the aggregates as truly existent is explained as the root of cyclic existence." And then in the commentary on the middle way it says, "Seeing with his mind that all faults of the afflictions arise from the view of the transitory collection." So he's making a point, right? He's saying, in one text, Nagarjuna is saying, viewing the aggregates as inherently existent is the root of samsara. I'll say, right? Cyclic existence means samsara. Right? And then I think the commentary in the middle, I think it's Chandrakirti's text, right? And he's saying the view of the transitory collection is the root of samsara. Right? And so he's drawing a subtle distinction here, right? And I just want to point out what it is. Because when you first read it, if you just were to read, "As long as one apprehends the aggregate, so long will apprehend a self," you could think that is the view of the transitory collection. But that's not what Nagarjuna and Lama Tsongkhapa are saying. Here, that quote is saying, if you grasp at the aggregates themselves as inherently existent, right? So that's not grasping at a self of person, as an I or a mind, right? That means when you see, for example, so if you think, what does that mean in terms of the aggregates, right? That when you look at that, like when you see your own body, it seems like it exists from its own side, right? And when you have in your mind, right, like when say you feel anger, it seems like the anger is intrinsically existent. It's a self-existent anger. When you feel desire, it seems like desire exists from its own side, has some kind of reality there, right? Not just labeled by them. And so here what Nagarjuna is saying is, as long as you grasp at phenomena, whether they're mental phenomena or physical phenomena, as intrinsically existent, so long then you will apprehend a self, right? And that's the root of samsara. In the other quote, it's saying the view of the transitory collection, so grasping at an I and a mind are the root of samsara. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is raising a kind of subtle distinction here, right? He's saying, so somebody could object, right? Somebody could say, well, wait, which is it? Because grasping at a self if you grasp at a self of phenomena, that's not the same as grasping at a self of person. It's not identical. So somebody could object and say, well, which is it? Do you have two different roots of samsara? Right? So he's doing like a debate. Does that make sense? Because the view of transitory collection is grasping at I and mine, right? But grasping at the aggregates themselves as inherently existent is not yet saying I. Right? If you say the body, it inherently exists, right? Or the emotion inherently exists, or consciousness inherently exists. That's not the same as grasping at a sense of I. It's not identical to grasping at a sense of I or mine. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa gives an answer to the question, to the sort of debate question he raised. He says there's no fault, like he's saying there's no problem here, and he's going to explain why. Right? So he says this system, by this system he means the prasangika system, right? The consequentialist system of Chandrakirti and so on, distinguishes the two apprehensions of a self. So actually, what are the two apprehensions of a self? Are the self of persons and the self of phenomena, right? So a way of categorizing. He says this system only differentiates those by means of it's only a conceptual categorization, right? Persons and phenomena, and he's saying, but there's no difference in the aspect of their mode of apprehension, because both have the aspect of apprehending the object to be established by way of its own character. The contradiction of the seeming, we could say, contradiction of the two roots of cyclic existence is understood to consist in positing two different modes of apprehension that do not accord in their way of engaging objects. And then this next sentence. Therefore, when the apprehension of a self of phenomena is taught as the cause of the view of the transitory collection, the two internal divisions of ignorance are being pointed out as the cause and effect. So, he's making a couple different points here that are worth noting. Like, one is that in some other tenet systems, they would say that grasping at a self of persons is like a grosser level of grasping, and the grasping itself of phenomena is more subtle. But he's saying in the Prasangika system they're considered equally subtle. In other words, it's grasping at things existing from their own side, or existing intrinsically. And whether you're grasping at a self of persons or a self of phenomena, they have, what he says here, they have the same mode of apprehension. In other words, the psychological or the experiential process is the same. It's this process of things appearing to exist from their own side and believing them to exist from their own side. And that's true whether it's an emotion, whether it's your body, whether it's consciousness, or whether it's your person. So they have the same mode of apprehension. Does that make sense? So mode of apprehension means they're doing the same thing. They have the same way of perceiving. And then he's making another point here, actually, in that sentence I just read last, where he says, when the apprehension of a self of phenomena is taught as the cause, it is taught as the cause of the view of the transitory collection. The two internal divisions of ignorance are being pointed out as cause and effect. And so there, what he's getting at is this. He's actually getting at a subtle, psychological process, you could say, right? Which is this. And this is, again, all these points are for contemplation. So you have to, I'll go over it, and then you'd have to check for yourself, check your own experience, right? What he's saying here is this, is that, in one sense, the view of, viewing the aggregates as intrinsically existent and viewing the self as intrinsically existent have the same mode of apprehension, right? They're both ignorance in the same way. But then he's making a subtle distinction in terms of, not in terms of how subtle they are, but in terms of the actual process that we go through. And what he's saying there is this, is first you see your own aggregates, right? And they appear to you as if they exist from their own side because of ignorance, because of your infinite habituation to ignorance. When you see your own aggregates, they appear to you to exist independent of the mind, independent of being merely labeled. And then you believe that appearance, right? You ascribe to that appearance. That's self-grasping, when you grasp at or believe in that appearance, which is an unconscious, usually, process. We're not consciously thinking, my body exists intrinsically from its own side. We don't say those words to ourselves in the morning, but that's there in us as our way of apprehending our own body, let's say. Right? And what he's saying is, having grasped at a self of the aggregates, which is a phenomena, right? We then grasp at an I. and mine. And so, and that's because that's why, because there is, the I is dependent upon the aggregates, right? We merely label the I based upon the aggregates. So he's saying, in terms of sequence, we see the aggregates, we grasp with them as intrinsically existent. Then we label self, or I, on those aggregates, and then we believe that that's intrinsically existent. And he's saying, so if you were going to think of them from a, what's the word, earlier and later, or sequential perspective, you would say, and actually, Ken Turbochet made a point about this once, where a few times actually said this. In terms of like the causal process, first we grasp at a self of phenomena, meaning the aggregates, and then we grasp at a self of person, for a self, I. Then he's saying, when meditating on emptiness, when actually gaining realization, and this is not like because of level of subtlety, it's just, what Ken Turbochet he said was, he said, because it's easier, just from a practical perspective. He said, first one realizes the lack, at the emptiness, let's say, the emptiness of the self, of one's own self. And then, based upon whatever reasoning you use to realize the self of your own person, after that, when you look at your aggregate, when your aggregates appear, if you use that same reasoning, you'll realize the self, the emptiness of the aggregates. So they're equally subtle in terms of their mode of apprehension, using the term in the text. But in terms of how they arise, first we grasp at a self of phenomena, then we grasp at a self of persons. In terms of how, when we're going to gain liberation, first we realize the emptiness of our own person, then we realize the emptiness of phenomena, meaning in this case the aggregates. And another point that Nagarjuna makes, so there are various reasons I think why Lama Tsongkhapa is pointing this out, because again, like, this could seem sort of theoretical, but he's getting at the actual process that we do all the time, right? Like, so like, and if you think about how that happens, right? Like, so say you have some kind of strong emotion, right? Like desire or something, right? Like desire appears, actually it's true, isn't it? Like when desire appears to our mind, it appears like, Lama Tsongkhapa something that says, as solid as the Rocky Mountains. Like it seems so, concrete or something, right? And we believe that, right?
Tasty.
Yeah, exactly. It's like so strong in a way. And so we believe that false appearance, right? Actually, desire doesn't have any, it's what's the word? It's like, it exists like the moon reflected in water, right? It's a mere appearance based upon many causes and conditions. But we grasp at it as if it's solid and exists from its own side. And then, what's there to say, right? And then what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, and then in that moment, the I is based upon that appearance, right? So we label I feel this, I want that. Right? And then some other appearance arises, and then we grasp with that, and then we say I. And so we're continually doing this process. So we can watch that happen, actually, right? Because the I is always labeled on a basis of some appearance. Does that make sense? And we're grasping, and Nagarjuna also, in other texts and in other places, points something out, which is he says, therefore, there's an implication to this, right? That as long as one apprehends the aggregates, meaning the aggregates as inherently existent, one will apprehend a self as inherently existent. So what he's saying there is, if you leave something, like he's saying, if you experientially, like, if you continue to grasp at something as inherently existent, eventually your grasping at a truly existent I will come back also. Does that make sense? So as long as you continue to hold on to something as inherently existent, and that's one of his critiques, for example, of the, well, not his, but he didn't write about the mind-only school, I don't think, but Chandrakirti uses that point to say, that's a problem of the mind-only school. If you continue to grasp at mind as inherently existent, eventually your sense of a truly existent self will come back. So even if you undermine all other grasping, right? But you continue to grasp from a Prasangika perspective. If you continue to grasp at the idea, let's say, that the mind itself exists inherently from its own side, then eventually you'll grasp at a self that's the owner of that mind, or that's labeled, well, you don't see that it's labeled on that mind, but you'll label I on that mind, and then it'll appear as if the mind itself, once it appears that the mind is intrinsically existent, an I will again appear as intrinsically existent. And then again you'll have the cycle that will give rise to anger and craving and so on. That will give rise to karma, and you'll continue to take rebirth. So Nagarjuna is pointing out, eventually you have to realize the emptiness of all phenomena, or you won't become liberated. So there are many implications to this little, this brief sort of philosophical point.
But
Yeah.
it's getting a little confusing, so I just
Okay.
wanted to clarify. So when you say the order of operation here for the mind, first the selfness of a phenomenon would come first, meaning the aggregate, and then the selflessness of the person would come next. Self of the person would come next. I would come next. First the aggregate, and then when we are liberated, you said it's the reverse order. First you say I don't exist, and then the aggregate don't exist. So on the first part, when we say it's more like mine exists as opposed to I exist, mine, and then.
Oh, it's
I
not
come-
mine yet, though, because it's not. In this case, it's just like a. So when it's actually interesting, isn't it? It's first grasping at itself a phenomena which is not mine yet. Like so, in this case, it would be grasping at the aggregate itself as existing from its own side. Then I exist from my own side. Then that aggregate's mine.
Oh.
Yeah. So it'd be like
So there's
that.
no element of desire in there, and these are all innate ignorance we're talking about throughout the process.
Yeah, but it could be grasping at anything. In this case, everything appears that way. Like so, it could be. Everything, to us, everything, like a chair, our own body, our emotions, our consciousness, everything appears as if it exists independently, or exists intrinsically, you could say. But it's not, so it's saying that grasping at one's own, the appearance, our aggregates appear, right? So there's an appearance to us, sometimes we say a mere appearance, but anyway, there's an appearance to us of the aggregates. But already there's a problem, right? Because when our aggregates appear, due to previous, this is a Prasangika perspective, right? Due to our previous conditioning, a beginningless conditioning of ignorance, when our aggregates appear to us, they appear as if they exist, I'll say, from their own side, not merely labeled. And we believe that appearance. So that, so say you wake up in the morning, right? So there's appearance of your body, and say you're still feeling tired when you first woke up, right? So there's appearance, like the body, and so the appearance of the body and the appearance of tired, right, seem to exist from their own side also. It's not like merely labeled body, merely labeled tired. So the person wakes up and there's this appearance of their body and some experience of still being tired. Right? And the person, those things appear as if they exist from their own side, and the person believes that appearance. Then the person has their sense of I based upon that, right? So they label it like there's the appearance of the body and the mind. I'm just giving an example, right? Then the person, they're not aware of it, right? But there's the merely labeled I, but then they're apprehending as if there's a truly existent I, right? So then they have this appearance of I, right? And then they say there's a sense of mind, like, oh, my body is tired, or something, or my mind is tired, and so it's like that. It's a sequential. I mean, it's very fast, but he's getting at there is a kind of sequential process in how we give rise to these different examples or instances of ignorance, actually. And what he's saying is they're all ignorance, grasping at a truly existent self. All of those, some of them are a self of phenomena, some are a self of person, but they're all the same. They all have the same mode of apprehension, meaning they're all ignorance grasping at something inherently existent. So does that make more sense? Okay. And that's what he's saying next here. These are divisions of ignorance. Then he says, when the two are taught as the root of the mental afflictions, they are pointed out as the root of all the mental afflictions whose mode of apprehension is discordant with, excuse me. They are pointed out as the root of all the mental afflictions whose mode of apprehension is discordant with them. Since the two of them also have that aspect, there is no contradiction. Just as there is no contradiction both in earlier and later moments of the same kind of ignorance being the root of psychic existence. So what he's saying is, one is kind of grasping at a self of phenomena, the next is grasping at a self of person, but they're both ignorance, and they're concordant. Does that make sense? Or as they perceive things in the same way, one give rise to the other, and they sort of keep giving rise through this process of habituation to that same process. And he says, although it does not appear that the Venerable Chandrakirti, what he's saying here is Chandrakirti specifically. And so here he's saying that the view of the transitory collection, Chandrakirti defined it as the apprehension of things as truly existent, and therefore it is a kind of afflicted ignorance. So he's saying he couldn't find there wasn't a sentence where Chandrakirti said, the view of the transitory collection is an afflicted ignorance, but there's sentences where Chandrakirti said, the view of the transitory collection view things as truly existent, and he's saying, and that is afflicted ignorance, so that's what Chandrakirti is saying. And then he says here, he's saying that Chandrakirti says the apprehension of a self of persons is the apprehensions of persons as established by way of their own character. So that's what we've been saying, right? There are all these synonyms, right? By way of their own character, from their own side, inherently, intrinsically. Those are all, in the Prasangika philosophical language, those are all synonyms. They all mean the same thing, right? So established by way of their own character. Right, as if there's a self established from its own side by way of its own character, not merely labeled on the aggregates, right? So he's saying that is what the view of the transitory collection is. Yeah, and so he ends with saying, so those are all, whether you're talking about grasping at a self-existent, or the aggregates as existing by way of their own character, or the sense of I existing by way of their own character, they're the same. They have the same mode of apprehension, and they're both ignorance. One other small point I'll just, that's not in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, but I'll just mention, is in terms of just going back to the view of the transitory collection, I left one thing out that I just wanted to mention, just so people know in case you're studying it in other contexts or something. So this is not, it's just because, you're becoming familiar with this language and we're studying this language. So, right, so we said I and mine. I just wanted to clarify one point about that. So that, the sense of I is now clear, right? It's the sense, it's this view of, what do you say? Of the self, of yourself, existing by way of its own character or from its own side or intrinsically. And then in terms of mind, right? That in Buddhist philosophy, they categorize two types of mind. Yes, or something. Mindness? Is that a good word? I don't know. Mind. One is things that are within your own continuum. So when you read mind, you just may not know what that means unless you study. So things within your own continuum could mean like my eyeballs, my ears, my nose, right? It could also mean my anger, my desire, my jealousy, could mean my consciousness. It could also mean your good qualities, like my compassion, right? My love, my insight, my understanding, something like that. So those are all things that are that are merely labeled as within your own continuum, let's say. But and then there's another category of mind, which is things you own, right? That aren't part of your continuum. Your house, your car, your glasses, your shirt, you don't. I mean, that we don't label those as me, but we do call them mine. And so when we say mine, it can mean either of them. Because sometimes that can be confusing when you're reading Buddhist texts. Sometimes you'll see where they're referring to mine, but they're clearly meaning like, my consciousness or my craving or something. And other times they're talking about mine, but it's like my chariot or my vase. Usually, in Buddhist texts, it's not that. It's usually I was laughing at that recently. It's, like,
So
it's
one
usually a
is-
chariot or a vase, it seems like.
So, Dr. Lauren, what you're saying is one is physical and one is mental.
No, because even some of the, like, so if you think of the things that are within your own continuum, that can include physical, like your eyeball, or it can include mental, like your happiness. But then there, the other one, like, so it would be like things you, that are not part of who you are. Like, so your home, for example, or your...
That has to be physical.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I can't think of an example that wouldn't be physical. Yeah.
You see my wealth?
Yeah, your wealth. So that would be a mind that's not part of your own continuum, but that's that you consider yours, in the and that is yours conventionally, but it's not part of your own continuum in the sense that you don't say that's part of my body and mind. Yeah. So the one that are part of continuum means it's part of your own body and mind. The others are things you own that are not part of your own body and mind. That's one I simply put.
It almost sounds like a co-creative cause and a substantial cause of a being. So you need wealth and food
Yeah.
and all that.
That's an interesting point.
If you say my idea, what's that? Is that external or continual?
No, that's an interesting question.
Seems like you could have
I think
your thought of an external object, like that thought is yours object.
You think it's yours, but it's really not. But it's not concrete.
Yeah, I think once you have, like, once it's in your, because that is still part of, you would say it's part of your, I think that would be part of your own continuum at that point. Yeah, it's like, and it's an interesting point though, isn't it? Because it's like food, isn't it? Like, it's like if I eat an apple, right? Like, so let's say I go to the store and I buy an apple. Like, then the apple it's mine in the sense I bought it, but it's not part of my continuum because it's on the counter. But then once I eat it, of course, then I don't call it an apple. But I can say, oh, I ate an apple, right? But now it's the matter that was part of that apple is part of my continuum temporarily. Then when I go to the bathroom, it's no longer part of my, so that also shows it's not, these categories are, they're actually they're labeled, in a sense. But I think the same goes with an idea. Like, so if say I'm at a class and a professor says some idea I never heard before. So at first I would say, oh, it would be labeled there, oh, that professor had this idea. Like, so you could think that, right? Like, when you're first in a classroom and the professor says something, you say, oh, that was an interesting idea, that professor had an interesting idea, But then sometime later, if you like, you could think of an example, right, where then now it's my idea, right? And then it's part of my continuum at that time, because it's part of like it would be inside, it's part of my continuum at that point, because it's part of my sense of, like, it's inside me then. Right? And then if I share it with somebody else and they have that idea, so it depends where it is, isn't it? When it's the professor's idea, it's outside my continuum, But then once it shows why these are also, if you start to contemplate this deeply, it helps you understand emptiness, isn't it? Because it's dependently, you start to realize, well, none of these things, they seem independent, right? But then as we start to contemplate it, we start to realize they're not independent. Now the next outline heading says, the demonstration of the noble father and son, so that's Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, assert the apprehension of true existence to be the root of cyclic existence. So he says here, all the other innate and artificial mental afflictions, as they operate, apprehend individual features of that very object superimposed by innate ignorance explained earlier. Therefore, just as the other four sense powers, the eyes and so forth, abide in dependence upon the body sense power, rather than abiding in a separate sphere independently, all the other mental afflictions also operate in dependence upon innate ignorance, which is why delusion is said to be the chief. Then he quotes, delusion abides in all of them, like the body sense power throughout the body. And then he quotes Chandrakirti here. Desire and so forth also operate by superimposing features, such as attractiveness and repulsiveness, on the mere inherent existence of things, imputed by delusion. Therefore, they operate in a manner that is not different from delusion and even depend upon it, for delusion is chief. So this is extremely important point, and it's really a point both to understand and to practice, right? So, and actually, this is like, this relates to our daily life all the time, doesn't it? So what he's saying is, you know, once you apprehend yourself as inherently existent, right, and you'll also then, you know, let's say it right. If you apprehend the self, yourself, as inherently existent, then you'll apprehend other as inherently existent, right? And once you do that, right, then, you'll inevitably you'll begin to then. So the first, it was getting us very. So the first superimposition is of inherent existence, right? That things exist from their own side, or exist by their own nature, or by their own, what do you say, character. Right? And then, once you've done that in regards to self and other, inevitably, and without any choice, you'll begin to superimpose attractiveness or unattractiveness, like attractiveness or ugliness onto everything, or anything. And then you'll begin to superimpose all kinds of things, right, onto objects. So once you believe, like, I inherently exist, and this other inherently exists, right? Then you're never going to start. You're going to start wanting something, right? And and then you're also going to dislike other things, right? And that's going to give rise to attachment, hatred, you know. And then you're going to start to, you know, and then we create all these other different levels of superimposition. So as soon as I feel I'm intrinsically existent and this other is intrinsically existent, then we can start to, with pride, right? We can think, well, I'm better than that other. I'm worse than this other. Then we can have insecurity, right? We start, and those are subsequent superimpositions, is the point, right? And you won't give rise to all those other superimpositions if you don't have the sense of I existing intrinsically. And so part of this is like, as you go about your daily life, right, it's quite interesting. What they're getting is a number of things. One is, there's one implication to this, many implications, but one is, if you can refute experientially that sense of the I existing intrinsically, then all the other mental afflictions will stop, because they depend upon that. Right? And it's their nature to depend upon it. All the other superimpositions will stop. Another point is that, so as you go about your daily life, if you really want to practice this, right, like, it's not enough to just read it, is it? Like, we have to go about and start to notice. Because, like, actually, if you notice it, like, when you think something is desirable, right, like, if you check, like, we don't usually stop to check, right, but if you check, it totally seems like the desirability exists in the side of the object, doesn't it? Like, it never, ever, like, never seems like you're projecting that. It's coming from your mind, right? And actually, it's funny, isn't it? Because, like, Buddhists say this, but even in the West, we have that saying, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? We have that saying. But actually, when you're desiring something, it never seems like the beauty of what you're desiring is just coming from the side of your eye or your mind, does it? Never once. Like, whatever the object is, right? Whether it's another person, or food, or money, or clothing, or something, like, it doesn't matter what you're desiring, it always seems like, it really feels like that, doesn't it? That there's something there in the side of the object that makes it desirable in some way, right? Like, and here what we're saying is, first of all, that's now that's grosser. What he's saying is that's grosser than emptiness of intrinsic existence, right? That's subsequent. Like, so it's based upon our having perceived the object as truly existent, we're now superimposing desirableness, as if it exists in the side of the object. And what he's saying is, the object doesn't exist from its own side, and for sure its desirability its desirableness doesn't exist from its own side. The same with hatred, right? like when you really are angry or can't stand somebody, or a person, let's say, hate somebody, or extremely angry at them, it totally appears to you, like you're never thinking, oh, I'm projecting all these qualities onto them and therefore I don't like them, right? Like if you thought that, you couldn't possibly, actually you couldn't hate them, right? If you thought my mind's making up, if you actually really believed my mind is making up these qualities, then you couldn't hate the person, right? You hate them because you think it appears to you, actually it really appears, right? It totally appears to your mind as if all these bad qualities exist in them, right? And part of this is, right, you can see what he's getting at, right? Whereas if you didn't believe, if you knew that there is no them even existing by way of its own character, then how could their stupidity or their ugliness or their horribleness exist by way of its own character? You know, and we think they exist by way of their own character to begin with, right? And then we superimpose other qualities. Like if we desire them, we think, oh, they're wonderful and they're beautiful and they're special. You know, if we hate them, then we think they're stupid and ugly and terrible. In either case, first we have to believe they exist by way of their own character. Then, and you see what he's saying, then we superimpose all these other things, and it never occurs to us that we superimposed existence by way of his own character to start with, and then it never occurs to us that we superimposed that they're so wonderful or so terrible or whatever. And so we believe that appearance, and based upon that, you can see now, clearly, right, that's how all of our mental afflictions happen. And then we do all kinds of actions based on that, right? Like if you desire enough, then you, and part of this is like, there comes a point, if you don't challenge ignorance, where a person doesn't, is like, you can actually see it then, right? You know, like sometimes in Buddhist texts will say, like, sometimes we're meditating on compassion, there are some texts that say this, but you can see it in relation to oneself. Like, you reach a point where you're insane and have no self-control, actually. Like, you don't even, like, in other words, you actually, because if you believe in the inherent existence of the person, right? And then let's say, I'm just giving an example, let's say you project all these bad, you know, like, so it's anger, right? So you think, oh, they're ugly, and they're stupid, and they're terrible, right? And you believe that exists from its own side. Then there comes a point where, right, you know, that person then does any little thing, and without any choice, you say something terrible to them, right? Or even you might hit them or something, you know, like whatever, like, and it's like you're a crazy person, right? From a Buddhist perspective. Like, so you can imagine for somebody who's realized emptiness, they would look and say, well, they never existed by way of their own character to start with. And then you made up all these other superimpositions that they were terrible and bad and all that. And then you acted based on that and screamed at them and belittled them or something. You know, and so it's like layer upon layer of superimposition or projection. We can use different words.
But when you get back down to the innate, there is a karmic relationship between you and the situation that is causing, I don't know if causing is the right word, causing things to arise in your own continuum. I mean, that's what mind training is all about.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to...
Well, part of this, you're right, and part of this is if you're meditating on emptiness, right? Let's say you're meditating on emptiness and then you go out, let's say you've been meditating well on emptiness, you know, like actually, you know, not like I do something, but like you're really meditating on emptiness, you know, and then you go out and like there's an appearance of somebody, your experience is like, then like, so let's say you've really been meditating on emptiness, then you go out and like you have some interaction and there's this appearance of somebody harming you, right? Like part of, if you were meditating on emptiness, given what you were just saying, Paul, for that, you know, if you were really meditating on emptiness effectively, what you would recognize is, oh wow, this is mere dependent origination, based upon previous causes and conditions, including my karma and then all kinds of other cooperative conditions. I'm having this mere appearance of harm, and you would recognize, actually, you would start to recognize, well, it appears to me as if, like you might even know, wow, look, my mind's starting to superimpose as if this person's bad. But
I'm usually recognizing it after I've done
yeah,
it.
yeah. But if you're meditating on emptiness, you would start to recognize, wow, like karma and all kinds of other, karma and my habituation to ignorance and my, all these other cooperative conditions are forcing me to have this kind of appearance, but it's not real. It doesn't exist in that way. They're not really intrinsically bad. If they were intrinsically bad, like they would, then when I was sitting and meditating, they would have had to be harming me, but they weren't. Like they're only harming me now because I'm interacting with them. And one of the cooperative conditions for them to harm me is I went over and interacted with them in some way, and it's just an appearance, like the moon reflected in water, and so on, like all that kind of, all these different metaphors and so on. But the actual fact of karma would help you understand that it's dependent origination. And if it's dependent origination, it can't be existent from its own side. Right? So if they're appearing to me that way, if the main cause of that is my own karma, that means they can't exist in the way I'm starting to perceive them. So that's empty like they're empty of existing in the way I'm starting to, and then you would actually use that to meditate on emptiness again, and then your anger would decrease, So in that way, it's like the harmony of the teachings on karma and the teachings on emptiness would help you in those kind of moments to realize that it's dependent origination, which means it's empty of existing by way of its own character. Yeah. So it's exactly right what you said.
That's true.
Makes more sense now, though. Thank you.
So just to clarify, if you have if your feeling is neutral towards an object, though, that doesn't mean you have realized emptiness either, right? So
No, good point.
it doesn't have to do with just lack of desire doesn't mean you have realized emptiness.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, and that's just that sometimes, if you actually, I left that out. There are three, right? There's if you look in the teachings on, there's like in the teachings on Buddhist psychology, what they say is actually we always are either finding things pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and so that would just be the neutral version. And that we all have that at times. It's like it's part of our normal way of interacting with the world, and so that would be the neutral category of. But we still are perceiving the object as inherently existent. So so it's not the same. Yeah. And so you get the idea here, right? That he's making a very clear point, that, right? So that all the other mental afflictions, they're making a couple different points here. One is they depend upon ignorance, right? This ignorance that superimposes existence by way of its own nature. And also that, and I like the way he puts it, right? He says it in different ways, but he's saying, in one way, so therefore ignorance is chief, it's the main problem, right? Another point he makes is it infuses all those. It's an interesting word, right? Like he says, like the body sense power infuses the other sense powers. So what he's getting at there is, and it's important, like if you actually, this is very, like you have to, check your own experience, right? But what he's saying is, so go back to the example of desire, right? Like when you're desiring something, and it seems as though the desire, sort of desirability, right, exists from the side of the character, from the side of the object, right? There's a couple points there. One is, that's not the same, that's not identical to just ignorance by itself, right? Because that's what you were getting at in a way, right? There's a point, for example, where we're not desiring, but we're still seeing things as existing by way of their own character out there. And then when we start to give rise to other, superimpositions, we can superimpose it's so beautiful, it's so wonderful, it's so great, and so on, and then until eventually we have this overwhelming experience of desire for the object. And what he's saying is, one thing he's saying here is that, so just superimposing inherent existence by way of its own character and then superimposing desire are different, but you have underlying desire in a way. Even as you're desiring, obviously there's still this belief that the thing itself exists by way of its own character, and that's the basis upon which you're then superimposing all these other things onto that. So it suffuses, or it sort of underlies, or this ignorance is always there as a sort of basis for all the other projections we make up, right? And it's the same thing with yourself, right? Like whether you, like, so a person, like, you know, so you could imagine, like, whatever, we've all had this experience of different feelings about ourselves, right? Like, so sometimes you might feel, oh, I'm just terrible and I can't do it, you know, and other times you might feel, oh, I'm wonderful and I'm so special, or something like that. You know, which are superimpositions, right? Using this term, but they're based upon the superposition of ignorance that believes you actually exist intrinsically, right? Neither of those is based on a merely labeled, but some a recognition of the merely appearing, merely labeled, right? So you have to believe, you have to have a kind of appearance and belief that there's a self that exists by way of its own character, and then you can superimpose on the, other characteristics. I'm the most wonderful, or I'm the worst, or I'm the most beautiful, or I'm so ugly, or I'm so brilliant, or I'm so stupid, whatever. But all those other superimpositions are based upon the superimposition of existence by way of its own character. Does that make sense? So that ignorance is a precondition for all the other mental afflictions, and sort of is even as they're existing, it's kind of like it's infusing them, or it's underlying them. Does that make sense? It's like because and that's important, because if you can, right, even when you're caught up in some mental affliction, if you can meditate on the emptiness of, there are many options actually, but one option is to start to recognize, like let's say, using that example of desire, right? One kind of antidote to desire, well, there are various ones. One is to look at the faults, right? So like if you recognize, I'm exaggerating the good qualities, then there's one set of teachings where you meditate, you sort of recognize, oh, wait a second, I'm exaggerating, and, like there are bad qualities in the object I desire, right? And that's just trying to sort of, like, after you've superimposed inherent existence, you've exaggerated all these good qualities, and you're just trying to get back to ignorance, in a way, like, from excessive desire. Like, okay, yeah, where you feel it exists inherently, but it's not so desirable, or so trying to decrease your desire that way. Then there's another method where you just recognize, well, all these projections about it's so wonderful are projections, right? That's another way of trying to undercut the desire. But then the deepest and most profound way of undercutting the desire is to meditate on emptiness, the lack of, that you yourself or the object or both don't exist by way of its own character at all. And if you meditate on emptiness, it's like you're pulling the rug out from under all the other projections, and they'll naturally decrease. Actually, this guy was listening to a recording of Kensor Machine. He was quite funny. He said that's the best. If you really want to understand emptiness, he was saying, like, in daily life, do that. And then he was saying, and if you meditate on emptiness very strongly, your desire and anger and other mental afflictions will decrease. And then he said, and then of course they'll get stronger again because you're not used to meditating on emptiness. And he said, but if you keep doing that, and if you keep meditating on emptiness, then it's like, he didn't use this metaphor, but it's like, if you've watched like, when they do a graph, like if you look from a distance, it looks like this, but if you look up close and it's real data, it's like more like that. And I think that's what, he didn't use that, he wasn't using a chart metaphor, but I was like, it's kind of like that. Like, of course you'll have increases and decreases, but if you keep meditating on emptiness, the overall amount of the mental afflictions will decrease over time, because your antidote is getting stronger, right? And the antidote is understanding things don't exist by way of their own character. And you can meditate on that anytime, right? Like, there are all these, like, and actually then, like, it's interesting, because then it's the one use of mental afflictions, isn't it? Because then if you're having, like, anger or pride or fear or jealousy or whatever, the mental affliction, from this teaching, okay, ignorance is here, right? And I can identify it more easily. Ignorance is always here, actually, but I can identify it more easily now, because it's like the mental afflictions sort of make our ignorance more overtly sort of apparent. And so when you're projecting all this other stuff, you can sort of say, all of this is merely projected by the mind. And then you have to check, right? It's not enough just to say that, but you have to check in your own experience and watch, like, what's my sense of I? Who's the I that's desiring? And actually, if you check, right, when you're really in a state of desire, that I seems so solid, right? And that's the object of negation then. And how wonderful that it's appearing very clearly. You know? Or when you're angry, the eye appears very clearly. When you're jealous, right, your eye appears so strongly, right? And so you can use those. It's an implication of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, isn't it? That ignorance will be there, you know, especially your sense of I. And then if you meditate on the emptiness of the I, searching where, in what sense does that I exist? You can use the different reasonings. We'll go, you know, then it becomes an antidote to the mental afflictions. And so here he's saying exactly that. He says he's saying once delusion has apprehended the objects as established by way of their own character, if the object is agreeable with one's mind, attachment arises as it is observed, and it appears to be. If the object is agreeable to one's mind, attachment arises, and if it appears disagreeable to one's mind, anger arises. So he's giving examples, right? And then he's saying, if the object does not appear either agreeable or disagreeable to one's own mind, it remains as an ordinary thing in between. And neither of the two arises when the object is observed by further delusion of the, so that's what he was saying. He was saying the same thing what we were saying there, right? So if the object just is neutral to you, then you just give rise to ignorance in regards to it, grasping it as existing by way of its own character. And then he quotes Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas on reasoning. Why would the great venom, the afflictions, not arise in those with a mind that is with their basis, even while in ordinary states it is seized by the snake of the mental afflictions? And so there is just an implication, right? He's reminding us. I think he's quoting that verse here. One is he's saying the same thing, right? That when he's saying here, why would the great venom, right? So the venom are the mental afflictions, right? It's like a poison. And so he's reminding us that the mental afflictions are the cause of all of our suffering, right? And then he's saying it will arise in a mind that has their basis. Their basis is ignorance grasping at inherent existence, or existence by way of its own character. Right? So if a mind has a grasping of existence by way of its own character, eventually it will give rise to the mental afflictions. And sometimes there can be long breaks, right? Like beings in the formless realms, for example. I mean, they don't give rise to gross mental afflictions like anger and attachment, but they have ignorance. And so this is, fundamental teaching of Buddhism is that if you have grasping at inherent existence, eventually those other mental afflictions will come back, because it's the foundation for them, it's the cause for them, it's like it's the fertile ground for all the mental afflictions. So even if you suppress your mental afflictions through calm abiding, for example, they'll come back unless you have a direct antidote to ignorance, because ignorance is the foundation of all mental afflictions. So he says here that the view of the transitory collection arises from apprehending the aggregates as truly existent appears to be the intended meaning of the precious garland as well. And that was what we said earlier, right? That from that first quote today, that was the precious garland quote. So he's saying what we said earlier. You grasp at the aggregates as if they're inherently existent, and then your sense of I, that's inherently existent, will arise, and so on. So we already covered that. The way the remaining mental afflictions arise should be inferred and understood from the explanations in the context of intermediate state beings. So he's saying there, we covered that early in the Lam Rim, right? That once you have this kind of ignorance and you're grasping at its I and at objects, again, that you can, it's actually funny, right? People can superimpose anything. Like once you've superimposed in an intrinsically existent I and an intrinsically existent other, it's actually funny. If you watch your own mind and you watch others, like that's where sometimes, like from a Buddhist perspective, we're all, crazy, right? Like because you can superimpose anything, and people will superimpose the exact opposite on the thing, and we can, we kill people based on our superimpositions, and it's totally out of control. And the only way to remember that, like, sometimes Lama Tsongkhapa would say, like, if you don't overcome your self grasping, right, and then eventually he was saying, like, it was part of like the faults of samsara. He was saying, like, eventually, over the course of lifetimes, you'll believe all kinds of crazy things. You'll be like a dictator. You'll be a murderer. You'll be because once you superimpose inherent existence, given enough time, you'll make up, and enough causes and conditions of external factors and internal factors. We believe all kinds of projections, right? We can superimpose all kinds of, like the most horrible sort of views, right? Like where people what's the word? Slavery and race, murder and all kinds of like horrific things. They all grow out of belief, like I'm intrinsically me and somebody else is intrinsically them, and then like we can make up any kind of view, right? Like sometimes our views are more harmful and sometimes they're less harmful. But if we don't overcome the root cause, then eventually all the other mental afflictions will come, right? Including hatred, for example. Right? And through hatred we do all kinds of terrible things. And so it's more reason to say, wow, I want to get rid of the cause of all that, right? That's all I'm saying. Is if you could uproot the deepest cause, because you could say in this life, oh, I'll never do some horrible thing, but you can't guarantee you won't over the course of lifetimes. Unless you uproot the cause, then none of those things can arise. That's all. So now Lama Tsongkhapa quotes Dharmakirti's Compendium on Valid Cognition. So Dharmakirti says, he says he, I want to say he or she. He or she who sees a self will always adhere to what he or she refers to as I. Through that adherence, there's craving for happiness. Through that craving, faults are obscured. So there, actually, let's pause there, and then we'll go on to the rest of these two verses, right? Actually, it's starting to get into a point that's kind of interesting, so I'll just bring this out. There are a number of points here. One that we can distinguish, and I think it's, actually the commentary I read didn't say this, but I think it's reasonable to assert it, so I'm going to assert it, and I could be wrong. So, what you say? This one, I mean, usually I'm being very careful, but I'm not 100% confident. Later, this is true. I'm not sure if Dharmakirti means this, though. But it says here, one who sees a self will always adhere to what he or she refers to as I. Because there's a point here that I want to make, which is the self does exist, right? There is, like, according to, now it's getting a little tricky because Dharmakirti is a follower of the mind-only school and we're doing Prasangika. But I'm going to say it from a Prasangika perspective for a second. Right? The self, there is a person, does exist, right? It exists how? You could say as a mere dependent arising, or as a mere appearance, a merely labeled, right? But what this is getting at in part, and what this text is going to point out over and over again, in a certain way, it will point out, is that ordinary beings, when they apprehend the self that does exist, always are superimposing existence by way of its own nature. Does that make sense? So and which doesn't exist, right? And so we mix together what does exist. We don't separate out the merely labeled I from the I that exists by way of its own character. That's the phrase used here. I also use that phrase. So in other words, when we see the self that does exist, we superimpose existence by way of its own character all the time. And once we do that, right, we adhere to that, and then we want that self, and then he's saying, and we want that self to be happiness. And through that craving, we give rise to craving, and faults are obscured. So when faults are obscured, what he's saying is, we don't see, now he's talking about desire, right? Once you he's just saying what we said earlier, I just was making a slight distinction, the self that does exist and the self that doesn't exist. But once we adhere to, or ascribe to, or grasp at the self that does not really exist, then we want that self to be happy, right? And then part of how we try to give rise to that happiness, which is why, and this is, there's that famous line from Shanti Deva, where he says, although they want to be happy, they run towards suffering. That kind of thing, right? There's, we create in our attempts to be happy, we create our own suffering. Right? And so in part, how do we do that? Well, if we superimpose, and this is the problem, isn't it? It's what he's saying here. We superimpose onto the objects we desire characteristics that aren't there, and we fail to see the faults that are there, right? And when you're not seeing things accurately in that way, of course you're going to suffer, right? Or so when you want something, and then you can't see how that's going to cause you suffering, because you're not looking at you're not able actually to see the faults, because you've superimposed and you believe your own superimposition, so you're not seeing things accurately, right? And so that's where he's saying, through craving, faults are obscured. We don't see the faults in what we desire, and so we run after it, and therefore we suffer, right? Only the good qualities are seen, whereby there's strong craving. What's mine is grasped, that which achieves them. As long as there is attachment to self, one will thus resolve in cyclic existence. So he's just pointing out, right, the process of how by grasping it, through superimposition we give rise to desire, and in that way we continue to suffer. And that suffering, in the case of desire, is we exaggerate, the superimposition of desire is we exaggerate the good qualities, and we fail to see the faults of the object. And then he just makes a point, he says, he actually saying, Dharmakirti wasn't a follower of the Prasangika system, he was a mind-only. In this case, in that text, he was a follower of the mind-only school. And he's saying, so, in terms of what he exactly means by the I, is slightly different than what Chandrakirti means. And he says, but in the context of what he's describing here, it doesn't matter. It's the same process. So there's a very subtle philosophical difference. That's not what Dharmakirti is addressing here. He's saying Dharmakirti's description of the process of how self-grasping gives rise to desire is consistent with the Prasangika's view. There's no difference in terms of that. In terms of the process of how we give rise to desire. I'm trying to establish a bit, like, yeah, and so he's just describing that process again on the next page, 249, right? Where he's describing how, we exaggerate the faults, we exaggerate the positive qualities, we don't see the faults. Consequently, mine is grasped as something to achieve the self's happiness. It's quite strange though, isn't it? Like, if you really contemplate this point deeply, like if you actually sit, because that's what, again, this is not for just, that's the point of all this, right? So you have to contemplate this when you're, first we have to contemplate it when we're reading like this and studying together, and thinking about it a little bit. But it's not actually very useful, I don't think, unless you then contemplate it when you're actually feeling desire, right? So in other words, that's the whole point of this, right? Is like we study it and we contemplate, we say, oh, that's interesting. Lama Tsongkhapa says that, but actually we don't want to think about it when we're actually feeling desire in a way. And that's the point, isn't it? Because we really believe, when we're feeling desire, we actually think it's going to make us happy. That's what he's saying, right? And so actually he would say that, right? If you read what he's actually saying, he's saying, when you're caught up in desire, in a way you won't want to think about this, because you'll think, well, if I get what I want, then I'll be happy, right? And he's saying, but that's the time to think about this, right? And to check your own experience. And part of this is like, if you don't check this against your own experience when you're actually feeling desire, then it'll be like the Dharma's over here and your experience is over here, and they always stay separate, right? And also then you might say, well, I practiced Dharma for so long and I'm not really happier or something. I'm not changed, but it's because like your Dharma and then your actual lived experience or state are kept separate. And so we do have to study these things, right? But then we have to actually think about them, like when you're feeling, when you're feeling desire for one thing and another thing and another thing and another thing, which luckily, since we're in the desire realm, as human beings, we have lots of opportunities for, we actually have to come back and check, like, okay, so is what Chandrakirti and Dharmakirti and the Guardian is saying true or not true? And you have to actually watch your own experience, like, am I exaggerating or not? And it's hard, because you won't, at first, I remember, this is not, I'm going to use a non-Buddhist quote for a second, because to me it's related, like, to this, in terms of that, on that level. I work as a psychologist. I remember it's the silliest quote in some way, but it's Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist. He once said, the unconscious really is unconscious. which is kind of a silly point. But my point, I mean, and that's a psychological, but it's similar to what this is saying. In other words, like, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, when you desire something, you really believe it's inherently desirable from its own side. And so even if another part of your mind is saying to you, hey, like the Buddha says this, right? Like at first, it's like you have to, it's as if you're debating with yourself, right? And at the beginning, when some part of you says, well, the Buddha says this, you're going to say, shut up. I don't care about that. Like, I'll think about that later after I've had what I desire, right? Like, and then you have to like kind of keep going, right? Like it's saying, well, at least stop for a minute and look at your own experience. Maybe you're exaggerating. And you won't want to actually, right? Like you'll be like, yes, later. Like, I mean, if you're honest with yourself, right? Like, because you'll believe, no, things are inherently as desirable from their own side, right? And I'll be happy. That's what he said, right? And there's no happiness at all without desire. It'll be the belief of desire, right? And in a way, like you have to become, it's like you have to, and actually it's an important point, like, because, sorry to say this right, like, actually, like we say, the wisdom of listening, the wisdom of contemplating, and the wisdom of meditating. All the, like, Buddhism always talks about that, right? Well, the wisdom of contemplating is what we're talking about now, right? And otherwise it always stays the wisdom of listening, right? Like, oh, I read a book, and the Buddha says this, the Buddha says that, and that's valid, I mean, it's useful. But the wisdom of contemplating is where when you're actually feeling angry or desirous, you pause, right? And you relate logic and what do I say, reasoning and scripture, right? All that, that sounds kind of abstract, I think. It's like you have to pause and go, well, is what Lama Tsongkhapa and the Buddha said right or wrong? Or is my delusion wrong? And like at first you won't want to do it, but you have to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. And it's only through repetition, right? There's no, like, never, I mean, if you look at how this is going to work for any normal person, it's going to only be many, many, many times doing that over and over and over. And I sometimes think, like, it's only the Dalai Lama says, right? Like, oh, which I don't, actually, it's funny. It's always the Dalai Lama says, I don't actually, it's funny, I in general, I believe it's always the Dalai Lama about everything, but this I actually don't believe in personally. When he says, oh, it took me 30 or 40 years, I think he actually understood it from the beginning, but I think he's saying it for a reason, where he says, oh, for 30 or 40 years I thought about emptiness, in order to have some understanding. Like, personally, I think he understood it from before, but I think he's saying for us, like, or at least, like, that's the process, right? That there is no other. One time I was in LA and somebody said, what's the quickest, easiest? And his son started crying. He said, there is no quick, and he said, like, there's no fast food version of enlightenment or something. So, like, there's no quick, easy path. And then he said, like, that he had practiced so hard, he had made so much effort for all these decades, Anyway, so the point being that we have to, that's the contemplative wisdom, is we have to actually relate it to our own experience, and that's hard. Right? Because we don't want to, and like we resist, and we believe in our delusions, which is what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is going to happen, right? He's saying, like, once you believe in the intrinsically existent I, that I is going to really believe I have to harm those who I think are unpleasant. I have to own and possess everything that I think is pleasant. And so we have to kind of contemplate these points over and over, and the deepest one, right, which is the one you'll least want to do in a way, is like when you're really feeling some mental affliction, to say, in what way does the I who's feeling this exist? Right? At the beginning, like that will seem totally irrelevant. Like it'll seem like, who cares? Like, like right now, if you're studying Buddhist philosophy, you'll say, oh, I care. But when you're really feeling a mental, like if you're really angry at somebody, and then like you were to say to yourself, first of all, don't try this with somebody else, right? Because they might hit you. If you say, in other words, if you saw one of your other friends here when they were really angry, you said, well, in what way does the I exist? And they want to punch you. So don't say it to somebody else. But we have to say it to ourselves, right? Like, in what way does that I exist? What's that?
They punch you, they're just trying to help.
Yeah. But we have to ask that ourselves over and over, and really, like, that's the Buddhist practice, right? It's like, that's the I. You know, like, and sometimes in Buddhism, they say, you know, like in Tibet, right, in Chud practice, they go to like a scary place at night to bring up the sense of I, right? Like going to a cemetery in the middle of the night or something. But actually, like, there was a teaching once by Lama Tsongkhapa where he said the real Chud, you know, Chud is that practice, right, where somebody will go off to the cemetery, and it's a beautiful practice. You know, do like music and all that. But Lama Tsongkhapa said the real Chud is whenever you have your ego mostly, you know, to face it then. He was saying, like, so if somebody insulted you, or if you're really upset by somebody, or you watch the news and you're freaking out, or you really want something, you know, like it was to stop then, and you don't need a drum, you don't need a bell, you don't need an external ritual, but that's the time because Chud really means it's cutting off, right? Cutting off, grasping at an inherent, at a self that exists by way of its own nature. That's the cutting. The word Chud means like chopping off. But so really, he was just saying this point. He was saying, like, the real brave practice is, I mean, it could be that ritual. That's a good practice. But he's saying anytime that your sense of I comes up very strongly with desire, with anger, with fear, with jealousy, whatever the afflictive emotion is, he said if you turn back on the I itself and meditate on it, like, that's the practice Lama Tsongkhapa is implying here. So, and then he says, he quotes the 70 stanzas, actions have mental afflictions as a cause, right? So you think karma, right? Karma is caused by the mental afflictions. The karmic patterns derive from the afflictions. The body has actions as cause. These three are empty and entity, of entityness. That's an interesting phrase. Of existing by way of their own entity. So, right? So what are the three? Mental afflictions, right? Karma, and the body. Right? And all of those are empty of existing by way of their own character. And again, he's saying the same thing, right? Nagarjuna there is saying, right, so you meditate on the emptiness of the mental afflictions when you're having a mental affliction, right? Or you meditate on the emptiness of the body when the body's suffering, or feeling good. And even karma itself, right, exists, because and it's not saying karma doesn't exist, right? But it's saying for karma to exist, it has to be dependently arisen, which means it doesn't exist by way of its own entity in some static way. So it's important. It's not saying these things don't exist. It's saying they don't. You get that, right? That existing by way of its own character or entity isn't saying it doesn't exist. It's saying it doesn't exist in that way. So it's describing how it exists and how it doesn't exist. It's not saying it doesn't exist at all. So it's saying you should train in this manner to gain certainty regarding the stages of revolving in cyclic existence. Right, so train in this manner is what I've been talking about, right? Like, in other words, because actually it's interesting, train in this manner doesn't mean, he's saying, like, you read this book, right, or, you know, Lama Tsongkhapa, you read Lam Rim, you read various Buddhist texts, but training in this manner means, it's actually funny, right, because it's actually true, you know, like we always say that, right, like, oh, samsara is not a place, right? Samsara isn't like when I was, I don't know, like, it's not like, Las Vegas is samsara or something, or whatever, like, as if Washington D.C. would not be that, I don't know. Anyway, it's kind of fun. It's not samsara, what is, you know, so, yeah, they're all samsaras. But actually none of them are samsara. Samsara is this, right? It's like samsara, really watching samsara is understanding samsara means watching your own mind. And if you get to the point, you know, like we say renunciation, right? Like, real renunciation is when you recognize, like, as long as I believe in a self, in a self in me that exists by way of its own character, I'm like a prisoner, right? Like, of that belief. And then with no choice, I'm going to have all kinds of, as long as I believe in that, without any choice, I'm going to be stuck in craving and fear and rage and terror and horror and all that. And those will come up over and over again in my mind because of that belief. And if I overcome that belief, I'll be liberated. and then you develop like this kind of deep, deep yearning to overcome the belief in an inherently existent I, your own, right? Because through watching your own process, you become confident, right? Otherwise, it's just learning, it's the level of listening, right? He's saying here, train in this manner means notice over and over again your own process, and you see, wow, you start to recognize, wow, I've been suffering because of that ignorance. And that ignorance is not somewhere else. It's not somebody else's fault. It's just inside me. And I can overcome it. And overcoming it is just practice. It's nothing magical, right? It's just by meditating over and over again, it decreases and eventually it'll stop. So that's what he's saying. Gain certainty. Gaining certainty means you have to see it in your own experience, right? And just somebody else saying it doesn't help, does it? You have to actually see your own experience, and then it starts to, and the more you look at that, the more it'll change. So then, the reason why you need to seek the view realizing selflessness if you wish to abandon that ignorance. So he says here, I'll read this paragraph because it's an important paragraph. It is necessary to want the extinction in which ignorance explained above, the true apprehension of the self, has been abandoned. Right, that's what we're talking about. That's renunciation. Actually, that's renunciation, isn't it? The wish to have the extinction of the ignorance explained above. And then he says, it is also asserted as necessary and even seems to be wanted. That being so, someone who wants but does not put effort into understanding how apprehending a self becomes the root of psychic existence has very dull faculties. That's a polite way of putting it. Yeah. Recently I've been reading a little bit of Lama Tsongkhapa's student, Kedrubje. He's one of the two closest cited in the picture here. He's the one on our right there. And he's quite funny. You can see he's different than Lama Tsongkhapa. He says, where Lama Tsongkhapa says of dull faculties, Kedrubje will say, is a complete idiot. I'm like, oh wow, he's making the same point his teacher made, but in a more in a slightly harsher way. So does someone who, despite partial insight into this, does not put effort into generating the pure view of selflessness in his or her continuum. Having thoroughly refuted the object apprehended by the apprehension of a self with scriptures and definitive meanings as well as reasoning. This is because they have lost the vital essence of the path leading to liberation and omniscience. They remain indifferent about it. So he's really you see what he's getting at here? And actually it's really important, one is we sometimes, I think this sometimes. Sometimes I have this idea, and I think we all do, as if the path to enlightenment is something, I see a picture of sometimes I romanticize, right? So if I see a picture of a Tibetan yogi, and it says, oh, they lived in a cave and they came out of the cave or something, I'll think, oh, that's path to enlightenment. But actually, if you don't know what the person did in the cave, you don't know that at all. There are Mormons live in caves too. And so my point isn't that's good, but my point is it's not something external. And that's what he's saying, right? You have to recognize ignorance in your own experience. And you have to want to extinguish that ignorance in your own experience. Right? And if you don't, then whether you're in Northern Virginia or a cave in Tibet, or you're in India, or you're in China, or wherever, it doesn't matter, right? You have to recognize your own process of what he's been describing, right? Of how you superimpose. I have to recognize how I superimpose existence by way of its own nature onto the aggregates. And I have to recognize how when I superimpose, first I going through the whole process he's been describing, right? You have to see how I wake up in the morning and the aggregates appear to me as if they're inherently existent. Right? And I believe that. And I don't even question it. Right? And then there's an I that's merely labeled, but I mix together an I existing by way of its own character. Right? And then because of that, I want certain things, and I don't want other things, right? And then I give rise to craving and desire, and then I give rise to anger, and then I give rise to jealousy, pride, all the other mental afflictions, right? And you have to kind of, through your own experience, recognize that process to the point, until you reach a point where you deeply and powerfully want to destroy, extinguish, right? Completely extinguish the ignorance, grasping at inherently, at existence by way of its own nature. And he's saying two things here. I just want to point them out, and then I'll pause. He's saying some people hear these teachings, but they don't actually relate them to their own experience and check to see, is ignorance the cause of all my suffering? And they do something else to relieve their suffering, like whatever, all the things we do, right? And he's saying if you hear a teaching like this and you don't check for your own experience, then you spend the rest of your life doing other stuff to achieve your happiness, then you're somebody of kind of dull faculty. This is what he's saying. Is what he's saying. And then he's saying, or some people, he's saying that's one kind of person, right? Then he's saying then there's a second kind of person who does contemplate this some, and does start to have some experience seeing, oh wow, it really is true. My ignorance is what causes my suffering. Then he says, but then they don't do much to try to, they just they don't actually go meditate repeatedly, using reasoning, and using the teachings to overcome that ignorance. And he's saying in both of those cases, they've lost the vital essence of the path, right? Or so then, and that's the danger, isn't it? Is then we can be sitting, and we could either be doing nothing related to Dharma practice, or we could sit around going through the motions of Dharma practice. But if we don't have this, if it's not harming our ignorance, then it's not going to grant us liberation, right? Even if you spend a lot of time if you spend no time doing Dharma practice, or you spend a lot of time doing Dharma practice, if none of it harms your ignorance, you're not going to be free from suffering. Does that make sense? So you could do Dharma practices, like ringing a bell or something like that. But if you're not harming your ignorance, then you're not harming your ignorance, right? You get the point. Sorry, no.
Okay, so you were talking about the extinguishing of the bad ways of looking. But then it says, in the second part, it says generating the pure view of selflessness, which is kind of the opposite of extinguishing. So I'm not understanding his context. It's like you're trying to generate. Just the word generate is messing with me.
And he's going to say more about that on the next page, but what he's saying here, actually I'll answer your question by if you look at the next quote on the page here, he quotes Dharmakirti, he says, without these objects being negated, they cannot possibly be abandoned. That's the first line, without these objects being negated, is the bottom of 249. In the top of 250s it says, they cannot be abandoned. And what he's getting at there is the pure view of selflessness, right? In other words, that it's a very important point that he's going to go into a lot of detail about coming up. But what he's going to start getting into is the mind, self-grasping, right? So the mind that grasps at a I that exists by way of its own character, using the phrase he used earlier. What he's going to get into now is, and what Dharmakirti said right there, is that essentially that only an apprehension of selflessness, right? Which means an apprehension of a direct contradiction to the grasping itself. So it's not enough to distract yourself. Let's say I'm grasping at a self of myself that exists by way of its own character. Rituals won't stop that. Distracting from that won't stop that. Meditating on the conventional nature of mind won't stop that. meditating on compassion won't even stop that. And the only thing that will stop that is, what was the phrase you used? Self.
Generate pure view.
The only thing that will stop that is the pure view of selflessness. So that's the only antidote to the mind grasping at a self existing by way of its own character, is the pure view of selflessness, which is a direct contradiction or refutation of
So you're not
that.
just extinguishing, but you're generating not in your continuum,
An insight.
an insight.
Yeah. Yeah, an insight into an insight or a realization that self existing by its own character doesn't exist at all.
Right.
Yeah, and without that insight, it won't go away. Yeah, so that's what it's saying.
Okay.
And that's exactly what he says down here. So he's saying, Dharma Kirti, without these objects being negated, right? So it means you have to actually give rise to the appearance of the false object, right? They cannot possibly be abandoned, right? So again, like nothing else, and he says here, abandoning hatred, desire, and so forth connected with faults and positive qualities is done by not seeing these in objects, not through some external approach, right? And then Lama Tsongkhapa actually uses an example of a thorn. He says, if you have a thorn, like in your skin, right, then you can use something like a pair of what's it called, a pair of tweezers, or a pin or something, right, to pull it out, right, to get it out of you. And he's saying, with the mental afflictions, it's not like that. There is no thing external. Does that make sense? Like you can't use, and it's interesting. Like so, it's actually an interesting point for a Tibetan Buddhist to be making, right? Because I mean, there's a lot of rituals in Tibetan Buddhism, and they're all quite wonderful and good. So he's not, and Lama Tsongkhapa taught them, so it's not contradicting. But he's actually saying, you know, like the hand implement of a Vajra can't remove you. You can't, like, there are rituals where you hold the Vajra to your heart and things like that, right? But they're not going to get rid of your ignorance. You know, and there are rituals where you ring a bell, which symbolizes wisdom, but the mere ring of a bell is not going to get rid of your ignorance, and so on. Like there is no external ritual, there is no external action, and that's what I was getting at. You know, even if you go to, you know, the same cave where Lama Tsongkhapa did retreat, unless you do the same kind of retreat, you're not going to have the same experience. You know, like, I mean, it's blessed to go there, and it's good, but you know, there is no external thing that will get rid of this ignorance, because it's in your own mental continuum, right? You have to, and it's actually interesting, like, at the beginning, you know, we can rely on reading or hearing somebody else's explanation to gain for our first level of understanding. But he's saying eventually you have to come to your own understanding through your own experience, right? And through your own practice. And so he says here, you know, if a thorn or has pierced your skin, you can't remove it. Then he says, you must abandon it, seeing that the object does not have the meaning apprehended. For instance, the apprehension of self. And so what he's really saying there is, you know, is what we were just talking about. Ignorance, the fundamental ignorance, is grasping at things existing by way of their own character. Right? That's the phrase he's using. So I'm going to use that. I'm trying to remember to keep using just that phrase, so it's not as confusing. And he's saying the only way to uproot that is to gain the wisdom that directly refutes and that directly refutes existence by way of its own character, and that sees that object has no existence at all. Right? Because like there is a conventionally existing, merely labeled self, but the self that exists by way of its own character doesn't exist at all. And from a Prasangika perspective, that self, the self that exists by way of its own character, it doesn't exist conventionally, it doesn't exist ultimately, it doesn't exist in any way. It's just like a hallucination. That self. Does that make sense? I'm trying to make sure it's clear. We're not saying there's no self at all. There is a merely labeled, merely conventional self. But a self existing by way of its own character, or a self that has its own entity, that self according to the Prasanghikas, doesn't exist conventionally, doesn't exist ultimately, doesn't exist at all. And it's only through your own recognition of that, through your own study and then reasoning and then checking with your own experience and doing that whole process, right, of like, you know, when you're angry, you meditate on it. When you're sad, you meditate on it. When you're afraid, you meditate on this. When you're, you know, when you look in the mirror, you meditate on it. When you go for a drive, you meditate. You know, whatever you're doing, you keep meditating on this topic, and eventually you come to your own insight through your own experience that that self doesn't exist at all, and that's the only antidote to grasping of that kind of self. And that's the only way to remove that or to extinguish that self-grasping. And now he says, the glorious Chandrakirti also taught that once all the afflictions, such as attachment, as well as birth, aging, sickness, death, and you know all that, are seen to arise from the apprehension of a self, desire to negate and abandon it will arise. At that point, the yogi negates with reasoning the object superimposed by the apprehension of a self, the self of a person, right? And so part of it is like, you know, he's implying, right? Nobody's gonna put, like, it's actually, you know, it's funny, like, the question would be like, we can actually ask ourselves, like, what do you do in order to try to be happy? In order to try not to suffer? And actually, like, if you ask yourself that, like, okay, what do I do, like, for that purpose? Like, I mean, it's probably a long list, right? If you live around here, like, actually our lives are more complicated than some people's lives. Like, living in this area, there's a lot of options. In other words, there are fewer options if you live in a small village, you know, remote part of the world. Like, so what do you do to try to be happy and not to suffer, right? And what he's saying here is that Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa are pointing out, if you're practicing Dharma, you know, if you're really practicing, then you start to recognize, and it can only come about through watching your own experience, right? That not through just hearing the words. That if you come to a recognition that all your suffering, including birth, aging, we were talking about aging, right? Birth, aging, sickness, death, loss, grief, you know, all the different suffering. The idea here is this: Chandrakirti is saying all those different kinds of suffering come from mental afflictions. Mental afflictions come from ignorance. And if you come to some kind of experiential recognition of that, then your main interest will be, how do I overcome ignorance? Because I don't want to suffer, right? And he's saying, like, that's not, you know, it's a really important point. It's not like some moralistic idea, right? It's not like it's not like, this is not saying Chandrakirti is telling you should go meditate on emptiness. Like, if you're doing it because you think Chandrakirti told you you're supposed to, it's not the right motivation anyway, right? Like, the motivation is you're recognizing, in other words, if you recognize experientially from your own contemplation and observation that Chandrakirti was right, then you'll actually want to do that. Because you want to be happy and don't want to suffer, right? And there's that if you're just doing it because you think somebody else told you to, it's not going to, then you don't understand why you're doing it anyway. You know, so Chandrakirti is saying, observe your own experience, check, analyze it. See if you can see how the mental afflictions come from ignorance. See if you can see how your suffering comes from your mental afflictions. If you do that, then you're going to deeply want to understand emptiness. And once you deeply want to understand emptiness, you're going to meditate on it, and contemplate it, and study it, and think about it, and relate it to your own experience over and over again. Because you'll also understand, and this is quite important, right, that ignorance is also empty of existing by way of its own character, right? It only arises due to causes and conditions, right? It's a mere dependent origination. And that means that if you apply an antidote to it, it will stop. That's what your question was about. How does it get extinguished or stopped? Well, it can get stopped, because it's also just a dependent origination, right? It doesn't have its own, if it existed by way of its own character, it would be permanent. And it would be like indestructible. But ignorance isn't indestructible. It arises due to causes and conditions, which are previous moments of ignorance. And if you apply their antidote, which is this recognition that the object of ignorance doesn't exist, then you'll become liberated. And it's not even that hard, is what, you know, they're implying. And the Dalai Lama said about that, you know, he actually, in his commentary to this section, he said, you have an advantage. He didn't use that word, but basically, those Lama in his commentary, it said you have an advantage because ignorance is grounded in something that doesn't exist. So it's, in one way, it's weak, in that sense, And wisdom is grounded in a recognition of reality. So if you start to apply wisdom, if you habituate yourself to wisdom, it'll have a kind of power, because it's true. And so if you apply yourself to wisdom, then wisdom will ultimately succeed, or win out, or something like that, because it's grounded in the truth. But if you don't apply yourself to it, then it won't, of course, but you get the point there. This is like, why would you meditate on emptiness? And if you start to understand this more and more deeply based on your own observation of your own experience, then it will become very powerful. And that's how one progresses. And then I think this quote is from Chandrakirti. Once his mind has seen all the afflictions and faults arise from the view of the transitory collection, a yogi knows the self to be its object and performs the negation of the self. And again, that there you could say, meaning the truly existent self, or the self existing by way of its own character, right? And he's saying it very clearly that you have to negate that self. You have to prove to yourself its non-existence. The yogi, and then he says, in fact, that is what someone who meditates on suchness must do. Therefore, it says a yogi, right? And so he's defining what's a yogi. He's saying, in the Buddhism, a yogi is somebody who does that. Oh, and now he's going to go through. This is fun. Now he's going to go through. He said, so he made this point, right? Relying on Chandrakirti, and now he's saying, in case you have doubts about whether this is true, he's going to go through. So first he says, this is also what Nagarjuna says, right? So now he's going to quote Nagarjuna to say Nagarjuna is saying the same thing, right? And then he's going to quote Aryadeva and then Shantideva. He's sort of saying, if you have any doubts about this, all the great luminaries of Mahayana Buddhism agree on this point. So here he says, he quotes Nagarjuna's 60 stanza reasoning. That is the cause of all the views. Without it, so that, right, that means self-grasping, right, or grasping at an I existing by way of its own character. So saying that kind of self-grasping is the cause of all views. Without it, afflictions do not arise. Therefore, if you thoroughly know this, views and afflictions are thoroughly cleansed. If you wonder how this is known, by seeing dependent origination, that beings born dependently are unborn. That was taught by the Supreme Omniscient One, I think you should say. Right, and so here he's making the same point that Chandrakirti made, but it also adds this phrase, which Chandrakirti used in other contexts, but dependent origination, right? And so what he's saying here is, when you look at the conventionally existing self, or the merely labeled self, you superimpose a self that exists by way of its own character. That self that exists by way of its own character doesn't exist because all existent things are mere dependent origination. And that which is dependently originated, when it says here, things born dependently are unborn. It's an interesting phrase, right? And what it's saying is something that's born dependently is not born or doesn't exist by way of its own character, right? So it's not saying it's not saying it doesn't exist at all, right? Or that things don't exist at all. But actually, things by way of their own character don't exist at all. Does that make sense? So things do exist as mere dependent originations, which means they don't exist by way of their own character. Right? That which is born, meaning that which is dependently arisen, is unborn in the sense that it doesn't exist by way of its own character. So you have to, otherwise it could seem confusing, that phrase. But if you understand what he's getting at, then it's quite clear. Then he's saying, now if it's not enough that Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna said that, Aryadeva said the same thing. And so he's saying, a statement by Aryadeva that accords with this, already quoted from the 400 stanzas, says, if selflessness is seen in objects, the seed of existence will be ceased. That is, through seeing the object of observation apprehended by the apprehension of a self, that it lacks a self, that lacks a self, the root of existence is cut. That's that same phrase, cut off, like I was saying earlier. And then he quotes Shantideva. The Venerable Shantideva also taught, thus the emptiness of persons is thoroughly established. Since their root has been cut, all the mental afflictions do not arise at all. Well, actually, yeah, no, we'll do that. Then he's saying, and if you don't believe, it's kind of funny, if you don't believe Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, and Shantideva, the Buddha said this too. So he's going to quote a sutra. He's saying, so, it's like, what's the word? There's a consensus, or he's got all the heavy hitters, I don't know what that is here. Right? Even the Buddha himself said this. So in the Noble Sutra of the Tathagata Secrets, the Buddha said, Shantimati, it is like this. For example, when a tree is cut at the root, all the branches, leaves, and twigs dry up. Likewise, Shantimati, when the view of the transitory collection is fully pacified, all the mental afflictions and secondary mental afflictions are fully pacified. Right? Which is quite a beautiful metaphor, or interesting metaphor, right? So he's saying, and it's a commonly used one in Buddhism, and the Buddha himself is saying it, right? So if you just, and actually, it's related to what we were saying earlier. When you're feeling, say, going back to the example I used earlier of desire, right? If you, let's say you're, in your own direct experience, like later today or tomorrow or something, if you're having some kind of strong feeling of desire, if you think about the faults of the object of desire, right? Like, so you're exaggerating. Part of the psychology of desire is an exaggeration. So if you're wanting something and then you start to think of the faults of it, that is an antidote to desire, but using this metaphor, that would be like pulling off a leaf, right? Like to the tree of suffering. And that's real. It actually gives you some relief. So it's not like that is a Dharma practice. But what he's saying here is, if when you're feeling desire, you meditate on the emptiness of the I, who's feeling desire, that's like you're hacking away at the roots of that tree, right? And we all know that. Like if you pull a few leaves off a tree, the tree will continue to grow. Whereas and what he's saying here is, if you destroy the roots of a tree, all the rest of the tree will die. So it's a metaphor, right? And the metaphor is, it's good to any method you can use to decrease your mental afflictions is good to do, but the main one is to meditate on the emptiness of the self, right? And he's saying here, if you do that, then all the mental afflictions will stop. So that's what he says here. It is saying that through cultivating the realization of the person as an emptiness empty of inherent establishment, the view of the transitory collection is stopped, and once that is stopped, all the other mental afflictions stop. Right? And so this is a practical instruction. Again, like, I think everybody's getting the point. This is not, you could read this and think, oh, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying something as if it were something separate from your experience, and it's not, right? He's saying, this is your choice, that you have the choice, right? That when you're feeling tomorrow, like some mental affliction, if you want to, you can meditate on the emptiness of yourself as the experiencer of that. And in that way, you're undermining the very root of all suffering. And he's saying, and if we don't choose to do that, then we're somebody with dull faculties, using his earlier quote, because we're not addressing the core issue, the deepest issue, which is the cause of suffering. And then he says, without the object of the apprehension of a self of persons having been negated, the realization of selflessness is impossible. Right? So you have to directly negate that self existing by way of its own character, or you won't realize selflessness, because actually that's what selflessness is the lack of existence at all of a self existing by way of its own character. And he's going to go into this more later, but if you just do other things that distract you from that self, that's not an antidote to it. It has to be a direct antidote. And the sutra points out that the view of the transitory collection, which we talked about earlier, is the root of all the other mental afflictions, and therefore it's a kind of ignorance. So now he summarizes all that. He says, in brief, when the many scholars who commented on the meaning of the scriptures of the profound settled the meaning of suchness, they carried out a thorough analysis by means of numerous scriptures and reasonings. They did that having perceived that it is impossible to realize selflessness and emptiness without seeing that the self, as apprehended by the mistaken apprehension, does not exist, and without seeing that it is empty of that self. It is essential to gain certainty with regards to this. And I'll just make a comment on that. Part of that is, like, let's say this right, like, you know, there are a lot of meditative methods that do calm down your mental afflictions, right? Anything, actually, just, you know, like, even if you just even just meditating on your breath calms down your mental afflictions somewhat, right? Like there is, and you know, and we know that, right? If you do that regularly, your mental afflictions kind of calm down, and they're less. So there are many, many, many. You know, if you meditate on love, it will decrease your mental afflictions. If you meditate on compassion, it will decrease your mental afflictions. You know, even if you meditate on, you know, if you meditate on unattractiveness of objects of desire, it will decrease your mental afflictions. If you meditate on, even if you just meditate on, like, pick a rock and stare at it, and just meditate on that, it'll decrease your mental afflictions, because your mind will be focused on that, you won't be thinking about other stuff, you know, that all the things you desire and are angry about, you'll get a break. So there are many, many things that will decrease our mental afflictions. But here what he's saying is, none of those are an actual cure, right? None of those will actually stop the process of samsara. And you get the point, it's quite straightforward, isn't it? I mean, he's saying it very clearly, but it's very clear, right? So you have to give rise in your own experience to an understanding of the object of negation, right? Which means your personal experience of how you experience, you know, because it can't be somebody else for you that doesn't help you, or me, or, you know, us. Like, so we have to give rise to our own direct experience of how we grasp at a self of ourself that exists by way of its own character. And then we have to directly refute that using reasoning and scripture, is what he says, right? And why, actually, right? Well, one is, like, because it's not enough just to say, actually, I mean, one thing is just to say, oh, that doesn't exist. Well, what's going to say, right? Like, it has to be your own, what's the word, experiential recognition or realization, or valid cognition. That's actually the technical term. You have to come to your own valid cognition. And actually there's this point that this, like it says, if you only ever gain wisdom of listening, right, so you listen, study, reading, something like that, then you can come to a kind of correct understanding in the moment, intellectually, but it's only a valid cognition that's incontrovertible. Does that make sense? So, whereas if you just sort of hear somebody out, like let's say you listen to someone like Khensa Rinpoche or Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche who's realized emptiness, you can have like some flavor of that by listening to them, where it'll be like some kind of like, wow, you know, you have some like moment of like insight actually, but it's dependent upon them. Does that make sense? And so then, like, there's a teaching that says, then if you listen to somebody else who gives the opposite, who says, no, the self exists and anger is good, you know, like, you may come to some kind of feeling, well, maybe anger is good, you know, and then you'll come to somebody else and they'll say this, and you'll feel, because it's under the influence of somebody else's power or insight or ideas or something. And a valid cognition is, they say, incontrovertible, which means a valid cognition has come about through your own process of insight and reasoning, you know, and you know it, like, let's say, like, you know it to your bones or something. It's like you know something, you know, and it's the same thing with any of these points, like suffering, right, the nature of suffering and how suffering arises. If you come to see that through your own direct experience and reasoning, then nobody can take that from you, right? Like somebody else can say, oh no, suffering is all because of like this other person, you know, and you'll say, you know, and you can like look at them, but it's not going to influence you, you know what I mean, because you know from your own experience something. Does that make sense? And here he's saying the insight into selflessness has to be like that. That you have to apply the reasoning. And why do we have to apply? So reasoning, one is you're not going to come to an insight. Selflessness is not. There are three kinds of categories of phenomena in Buddhism. You know, one is objects of obvious things, like of direct perception. You know, like, whatever. Like, you know, that this is blue or something. The main color and this is blue. Like that's an object, an obvious object represent. Then there are objects that are hidden and then very hidden, right? So emptiness is considered to be a hidden object, meaning it's not something you can perceive with your eyes or ears. You have to perceive it through reason. So you won't come to an understanding of emptiness. You can't see emptiness by looking around or something, right? You have to come to it through reasoning. And the reason why I mentioned scripture is, you know, like they say, actually, Lama Tsongkhapa, right, in that poem, his poem, Praise the Dependent Origination, which he wrote, they say actually that, like one night he realized, quite early in the morning, is when he realized emptiness directly. And then he wrote this poem praising the Buddha for teaching dependent origination. And in that poem he says, you know, there are many different spiritual traditions in the world, and there are many wonderful teachers. And he says to the Buddha, he's praising the Buddha, and he says, but Buddha, only you, of all the teachers all the teachers ever, only you taught how dependent origination proves emptiness, and how emptiness's deep meaning is dependent origination. You know, how those are like synonyms. Only you taught that. And so that's the idea here, is that one has to rely on kind of scriptures of the definitive meaning, meaning that kind of teaching. And that nobody else taught that. You know, and one won't come up with that idea on one's own. That's a unique teaching of the Buddha. That's the unique teaching of the Buddha. And so we have to rely on that kind of teaching to realize emptiness.
So, would you agree with the point saying you have to be Buddhist to be able to understand emptiness?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Yes. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to say it louder?
So,
He couldn't hear.
just a curious question. So, if you're not a Buddhist, you won't be able to understand emptiness?
I guess I would, we could debate, I mean, I know different debates, but I would say this, like, at the moment when you could say it this way, if we take like just the external level, at the moment when Shakyamuni Buddha understood emptiness, was he Buddhist?
There was no release.
I'm just debating. At the moment when he first understood emptiness, was he Buddhist? That's funny. So you have to, you know, then we say, you have to say no, right? Because then we can say, oh, the Buddha who understood emptiness wasn't Buddhist, or I don't know. That's funny.
I got that.
Yeah, you get my point there. But there's a point, I guess one point I'll say, just also to support what you're saying, is like, I remember one time when the Dalai Lama was having these like interfaith dialogues, and they were talking about love and compassion. He was having like a wonderful dialogue with some like Christian monks, I think it was. And they were talking about teachings on love and compassion. And then he said later, I heard him, I thought he was there, but he was giving like a lecture sometime, and he said, oh, then they asked me about emptiness. And I said, I'm not talking about that. That's not for you. That will undermine your faith in God. Like, it's not good.
Right.
Let's not discuss that. Which I thought was quite interesting. So there he was saying, like, so I mean, in one way you can't say, I mean, in one way, from one perspective, the label Buddhist is just a label, so that's not, you know, but from another perspective, I thought the Dalai Lama's point was good, which is that, you know, that he was saying when, you know, that, like, so for example, for a person whose faith is grounded in, say, you know, a creator or something, and if that's their tradition and their practice, so this was actually saying one shouldn't talk about emptiness, and that can be counterproductive and harmful to that person because it's not in accordance with their disposition. And he said, he said to them, I don't want to talk about that. Let's stay with love.
Okay, now, just because I recently read this, haven't realized this, or I just have, Thurman I was reading a book by Dr. Thurman, and he was comparing Wittgenstein's theories of language, of public and private languages, which is really close to the whole idea. And I can't begin, because I don't begin to understand all of that. But it was really interesting, so far, what little I understood. It's very, and he was making that point that this is really close to intrinsic and selfless.
Yeah, he loves
As opposed
Wittgenstein.
to- yeah.
He's a very big lover of Wittgenstein. Well, and that's another point, actually. So, yeah, and I guess I'm running back to your question also. According to Buddhism, they would say that bodhisattvas, who are Arya bodhisattvas, who have seen emptiness manifest, in all different traditions, and they can manifest as a musician or as a philosopher of some other tradition, and they've seen emptiness directly in some cases, but they may not teach that, but they've seen it, and they manifest in some, they take a rebirth to benefit others in some. So you can't say only Buddhists can understand emptiness, because then that wouldn't be possible. First of all, in the Buddha, when he saw emptiness, but then also you could say bodhisattvas take rebirth in all kinds of places to help others, and internally they may understand emptiness, but they may or may not talk about it to anybody else. That's up to them. But yeah, so there are many examples. So I think you couldn't say that then. That only Buddhists, I don't think we can say that. But we should stop. So we'll do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.